Good evening and welcome to the Oasis podcast. My name is Burnell Beachy, and joining me this evening is Pastor Steve Yoder. And we are kind of filling in for Pastor John and Pastor Wayne. They are in Israel right now. And I think if I looked at the schedule, I think they're up somewhere in close to Galilee, or at least they're up in Shiloh, somewhere up in that area. Yeah. So that is where they're at, and we're kind of holding things down until they get back.
We sure
and,
are.
And so bear with us.
Yeah.
Tonight for a subject, we have a subject called prioritizing the home, and I think this is a really important subject because if you look at the home and the way the home goes, so really goes our culture.
It does.
And goes our society. And, there's a little saying that goes, if you have a messed up man and he has a family, you have a messed up family. If that family goes to church, you have a messed up church. That church is part of a community. You have a messed up community. That community is part of a county. You have a messed up county. You have a messed up state. You have a messed up country. And therefore you have a messed up world. So if we're really going to change the world, we have to start at home, right with ourselves. And just looking at our culture, and a number of years ago, I had some rentals in the inner city, and I began to firsthand see the chaos and just the decline of our culture because of the home and the foundation, just the erosion. There's no foundation there. And many of these homes that I owned, you would rent it out to someone thinking you're renting it to two people, only to find out there's a stepson, stepdaughter, a boyfriend, and now you have almost a whole colony there that you weren't anticipating on renting it to. But I just firsthand began to see the way that a lot of the inner city views the world, and it's really through a lens that's really warped.
Yes,
and it's because they've been handed from one generation to the next, has not seen a functional home. And therefore, they're reliant on social services, socialized health care, food stamps, and looking to the government to provide. And as we all know, the more money you throw at a problem, the more it accelerates the problem. And so really, I know perhaps our viewers here this evening, we're not dealing with that kind of an extreme, yet it's still very important that we begin in the home and we prioritize the home. I'm preaching on Sunday, so I came across a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. It says, "Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall." And so even if we have been given a good foundation and a good solid heritage, which most of us have, it's still, we should always take heed lest we fall.
That's correct.
And so I have a few verses here that the Apostle Paul shares with us, and he instructs especially us as fathers. He really instructs the men, although I think this can go both ways to parents as well, to both parents. But in Ephesians 6, verse 4, he says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And then also in Colossians chapter 3, Paul almost word for word says the same thing. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged." Now, I saw here that the honor goes both ways. And we hear a lot of children honoring their mother and father, but it also says that especially as fathers, we are to honor our children, and lest they become discouraged or provoke them not. So, Steve, you have raised, what, 5 children?
5 children.
5 children?
They're all married,
Okay.
and we have 11 grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
So we're very blessed.
So I am still in the middle of raising my children, and I don't have grandchildren yet, but we have someone here with us this evening that has experienced a lot more than I have in raising children, so I get to ask Steve some questions that I would
Sure.
like some answers to as well. First of all, it says here that us, especially as fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. That word provoke in the Greek means to exasperate. How are some ways, or what are some ways that fathers could provoke their children to wrath or discourage them?
Okay, before I answer your question, I'm just going to speak a little bit, and then I'll come back to your question. But children are really dear to my heart, and my own children have been very dear to my heart. And in fact, when our last one, our son Matthew, got married, and they all have good marriages, and I'm glad they're married, but it was a difficult period of time for me to adjust because so much of my life had been wrapped up in my children, and my wife and I both. And so when that element leaves your home, you still have your children, but you don't have them from day to day, and we had such a good time with them when they were at home. So children are very close to my heart. In fact, I remember there was a very specific time when the Lord impressed on me the responsibility of having children. Up to that point, they were my children. I can still remember the spot I was at where somehow the Lord revealed to me that these children you have are a gift from me, and they're a responsibility for you. They are your children, but they're also given to you as a gift and as a responsibility. And that changed my life. The thing of provoking. So I'm going to speak both from my experience with my children, but also somewhat from my experience growing up as a child. And we had a good home, and I had good parents. So I'm going to speak from that aspect. But to provoke, I think the definition is maybe to exasperate or to drive a child, in this case, a child to frustration. And so there's several things that I know that can do that can contribute to it. One of the things that I think about is if your child can never do anything good enough for you or right enough for you, a child finds security in their parents, and they also find approval, or at least they should find some approval. And if we're the kind of person that everything they do is there's a little something wrong with, or a lot wrong with, finally a child can come to a place where they say, what's the point? I can't please my parents. And it really, I think it can contribute to a wrong view then of who God the Father is, where he can never be satisfied. So that's one way that I see that children can be provoked. And then another thing which I think is probably the greater part of this, that as we raise children, we have to remember that these are human beings. They're just small human beings. Well, at least they start out small. And they have emotions, obviously, they have feelings, but somehow, sometimes in our parenting or in our being adults, we tend to talk down to children and kind of forget these are human beings.
They're real,
And so there's a responsibility on us as parents to remember that we need to respect our children in the sense of treating them as another human being, and remember that this is also a creation that God has brought into being. What I'm getting at is they're not ours to dominate and to possess. And we have to remember. And so when this breaks down and a child feels like they cannot express themselves to their parents because their parents aren't, this is really about the art of listening to someone. And listening is not just hearing words, but understanding the heart from which they come from.
And every child is also very, very different.
Very different.
And if you treat them all the same, you're going to get some very different reactions. But still, one of the basic fundamental needs of every human being is the need to be understood.
Yes.
If you're not understood, you're going to find a group of people that will understand you. And especially as a parent, if you don't follow through and they don't feel like they're understood,
Right.
at some point they will try to find someone that will understand them.
That's right.
And so that's one way we can provoke our children.
That is
to
one way.
discouragement.
Yeah. If when a child wants to open up, but if for a heart, and this is for all of us, for a heart to open up, it has to be in an environment where it feels safety. And that's what a child needs to feel. But if a child opens up and then is criticized, or that makes them retreat. And that goes for any situation. A person opens up when they sense that there's safety here.
Exactly.
And we want the heart of our children.
Right.
So that's something that became very important to me, is that to listen, to really listen. What is my child saying? They might be talking about this, but what's the underlying thing that they're not saying but would like to say? And to really listen for that. And then again, back with the thing of find things to praise them, find things that they're good at, and give them commendation for it, and build them up in that. That's something we all want, and children are no different. But I come back to this thing of remembering that children, they have their own personality, and each one of the children we have is 5 children. They all have a different personality, different gifts, different traits, and we had to learn that. And a thing that you never want to say to your child, I think, is, why aren't you like your brother? Why aren't you like your sister? But to accept them as for the person that they are and their personality. I believe that's a big thing.
And one thing that my father did so well, my dad was never a man of a lot of words. We didn't have a lot of sit down and have fundamental discussions. My father was much more he came alongside, and one thing I really noticed my dad doing so well in was he became interested in the things that I was interested in, even though he himself had, especially deer hunting.
Yes.
I remember my dad would take me somewhere, and he had no interest. That was not something that he enjoyed doing at all. And yet he took interest in it and helped me find a place and helped me get permission and helped me set up tree stands. And I was pretty young yet. And I didn't even have a license. And so he would drop me off and pick me up. And, that to me spoke, at the time I probably didn't understand what my dad was doing. It's sometimes a child realizes that once they reach a certain age, they realize what mom and dad and the sacrifices they made. That's something he did so well in, is he took interest in the things that I was interested in. And he would look into them and ask questions and be interested, even though he himself had virtually no interest in it at all. Or sometimes you can find the tendency to perhaps latch on to a child that is more like you, and that has a lot more tendencies like you, versus perhaps a child that's very, very different from you. And so that's one thing, a lesson that I learned just from being with my dad is look at my children and their interests. And then even if it's something I really don't care about, become interested in it. And my son has a lathe down in the basement, and he takes a big interest in woodworking. And so sometimes I hear that thing whirring down there, and I hear wood chips flying and things. And so I just go down there and, hey, well, what are you making, son? Try to take an interest in what they're doing. And so I think it's important to look and learn the different aspects and to learn the different gifts and traits of each child, because you had 5
children,
and I'm sure they're all very different.
All very different. Some similar traits. And of course, in your children, you always see traits of yourself, some that you like and some that you don't like. But I've seen that. Yes. But children are such a blessing. They're such a gift from God.
They are.
And if we can see that, and society today really doesn't see it that way, I think, often. In fact, I had once I was on a job, and a gentleman asked me, he said, "Well, how many children do you have?" And I said, "Well, I have 5 children." And he said, "My, you're a glutton for punishment." And I said, no. I told him, no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
These children are a gift from God to
Yeah.
me. And I really did see it that way and continue to see it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a terrible attitude where we find that children are a burden to us because they would hinder our lifestyle or keep us from doing things that we could. Obviously, there's a responsibility and a
right.
burden there with children. But I can say from experience that if you give your heart to them, if you spend time with them, if you do the best you can with them, that will return to you many times.
over,
Those
yeah.
times that it was a sacrifice for you. My children are coming back now with their children, and they're
Yeah.
blessing us. And they are thanking us. And
Yeah.
now they see raising their own children.
What you,
Now they understand.
yeah. Well, that
And
has to be rewarding.
It is. It is very rewarding.
Yeah.
It's very rewarding, yeah.
Which you mentioned, you touched on that, which is prioritizing your children, which kind of brings me to another point here. Another thing I'd like to discuss is I work in a lot of different homes, which my job takes me into a lot of different homes, and I observe how that families raise their children, how they teach them, or perhaps a lack thereof. And so there's two examples I want to give you, and I want you to weigh in on them. So just was it last week? I worked in a home where every morning when I got there, both parents worked, and so every morning the grandparents would show up, and they would take the children. Now I don't know if they took them to a daycare. I don't know if the grandparents watched them all day, and I'm right there with them, and they're getting ready for work, and they're trying to get their children ready, and I could sense the tension of two parents trying to get ready to go to both of their careers. Now there's a set of grandparents there. The kids are crying, and they need things. And as I just observed that whole thing, I don't know how you would feel as a grandparent. I guess I told my children very clearly, I'll gladly watch your children, but I'm not going to raise them.
That's right.
And I see a lot of grandparents having to rise up and are kind of almost raising their children, where the children are sensing that I'm not important. My mom's career, my dad's career is more important than me. And so all of a sudden a child, when they don't feel prioritized, at some point, as soon as they're 16, 17, 18 years old, all of a sudden don't want anything to do with mom and dad because we weren't a priority. And another home this was years ago that I worked in, I hope people don't think I'm going around snooping in people's homes, but I can't help but just observe when I'm there. There's another home where I noticed that every morning the father would go to his job, and then the wife would go to her job. And then the grandparents happened to live just across the yard, and they would come, pick up the children, and put them on the school bus. And then pretty soon, Dad would come home. Well, pretty soon, in the evening, Dad would come home, but he had another, some kind of a coaching job or something. Then he would leave. And then all of a sudden, the kids would come home, and they're all there by themselves, unchaperoned. And then Mom would come home. And all of a sudden I noticed that this family never does anything together as a complete unit. And they never have a meal together. They're chauffeuring kids to one sporting event, mom taking one kid over here, dad taking another kid over there. And about a year later, I found out that the wife in this particular home happened to be having an affair with someone else, and now there was an ugly divorce.
Oh my!
And a home that's split apart. But when I look back over that whole thing, I said, I'm not that surprised.
Yeah.
Because as a family, you never did anything. And sometimes I think parents think they're doing their children a favor by taking them here and taking them there and taking them to their different events. But I see the family unit is not together. And speak into that some. I mean, first of all, how would you feel as a grandparent to have to now raise your grandchildren? And what do you think about the home or the unit not really being together much?
Well, as parents, grandparents, I thought when my children leave home, some of that burden will leave me as far as my care. But I find that now I'm carrying, my children are doing a wonderful job, but I continue to carry burdens. I carry my grandchildren on my shoulders and my children because we care.
Yeah.
We want to see them do well. And there's very unfortunate circumstances at times that that come into people's lives for any number of circumstances that can contribute to, for some reason, grandparents needing to be involved more with their children and grandchildren's lives. But it seems to me, in what you're saying, that much of that has been brought on simply by wrong priorities, which you already mentioned. And prioritize, if we want the right outcomes, then we need to prioritize the things that will get us the right outcomes. So that it really comes down to what goals do we have in life, and if our goals are misaligned, then our outcome will be wrong.
Right.
Those are principles that are very clear in God's Word.
Yeah.
Those are foundational things. So, our society seems to have put a lot of emphasis on sports, on careers, and I believe that has contributed to some of these downfalls that we see. One of the primary things that a child needs and desires and wants is safety and security, and to know where are my boundaries, and to know that there's a place, as I mentioned before, that this is a place I can come to. People love me here. I know my boundaries. There's authority here, and there's a safety there. And when that's missing, then children become restless. They kind of don't know where their anchor is. Home is to be that anchor. And and home is more than just two people raising having children, but it's a unit. It's a man, it's a woman committed to each other, and out of that commitment comes children. And God has designed it that way, and it works. If you keep your priorities right. There's difficulties. So, there's always unfortunate circumstances, but as a grandparent, those are things I want to see from continuing on in my children and their children's lives.
Well, basically what you said, if you do not prioritize your children, they will one day not prioritize
That's
you.
correct.
Because I think one of the most rewarding things is if your children want to be with you.
That's right.
And that's something we have always fought for, that one meal together. In the evening, we eat dinner all together. And, the interesting conversations that come from that, unplanned, we don't sit down with a dry eraser board and say, these are the things we're going to discuss tonight.
Right.
But it's just out of that conversations happen that would not otherwise. Now, obviously, when our kids started to get driver's license, they have their own activities, some of that changes. But we still, for the most part, even with our oldest being 20 years old, we sit together as a family and we have that meal together. And then, there's some dispersion from there. But for the most part, growing up and when the children were small, that was one thing that we felt was very, very important. And then out of that comes those conversations that you normally wouldn't have.
Right.
And instead of now having an 18-year-old that wants nothing to do with you, well, it's probably because you didn't prioritize them when they were this high.
Right.
And so, yes, prioritizing is so important.
It is.
Because if they don't feel priority, then and something else is, they will feel that. They'll sense that.
Children want to be part of something. That's why you see children who they become part of gangs. They want to. There's a set. They want to belong.
Yeah.
That's a human need. And a child wants to belong to something, something bigger than just themselves. And that's what the family unit is: the mother and the father and the children and the family. And so, if they're not finding that, then they're going to find it in some other place. But you mentioned something that I think is so important, and it comes back and ties into what I said about respect, is have a home where your children want to be with you.
Right.
Do things that interest them. these are things that we tried to do, we did do.
Mm-hmm.
I would go snow skiing with them. They liked that. And, you know, I had to endure some things as I got older. But they enjoyed that, and it helped us to do things, find things to do together with your family that they enjoy doing, whether it's hunting, fishing. There's all kinds of activities that we can do. Play together with them. It's, you know, and it takes time. There's no way to avoid that. You have to have time for your children. One of the things I try to do every year, this may not be possible for everybody, but our family, we tried to always take at least one vacation, one holiday where they had my time, completely undivided, all my attention, and often for a week, sometimes 2 weeks. And those times were always very special to them, and we still talk about them today.
The memories.
The memories of that. We continue to talk about them.
Wow. Yeah. Well, we're coming up here close before too long, but there's one more question that I'd like to ask you, and I'm dying to know the answer because I don't. How do we balance? Now, in this case, you are a business owner.
I am.
You are. You had a marriage, raised 5 children.
Raised 5 children.
And a bivocational pastor. Those are 4 pretty high-level things that you had to balance throughout your whole life. And you've obviously done well because you have the same wife and your children love you.
Yes.
You're successful in ministry and in business. So could you give our audience an answer as to how do you balance all of those things and the pressures? Because there's pressures in every one of them. There's pressures at business. There's pressures in ministry. There's pressures in marriage and raising your children. How do you handle the pressure, and how do you balance and maintain focus to do these things well the way that you have? Could you just allude to, or just give us?
I can speak
an
out of
answer?
my experience. It's a big question. And you've hit the 4 things that hit us very hard as parents, as believers. There's things that we're asked to. It's part of our duty to supply for our family. And there's responsibilities that, as ministers, that we have on us. And I know I went through times when I was there. I don't have enough to go around. That's the feeling that I think you're familiar with. That feeling. There's not enough of me. There's not enough to reach everywhere. I need to do this. I have this responsibility. How did I walk through those times? A good wife helps a tremendous amount. A tremendous amount. And I have a good wife. She has supported me. She has continued to love me. And so there were times because of ministry that I couldn't be at home when I felt it would be best for me to be home. And you know, Burnell, at the grace of God, at the end you have to say the grace of God has supported us. And I would talk to my children and explain to them why I needed to be gone at times. And they understood that. And so, you know, you would seek the Lord, I would seek the Lord, and I would try to determine what is my responsibility in this particular given situation. But I know there were times that I felt I was neglecting one or the other. And so in the end, I have to answer that it's the grace of God that saw us through and brought us to where we're at today. But I think we also have to remember as ministers that maybe we should look at first, our calling is to our family.
Right.
And we have to remember that. And to keep that in mind. When we raise children, those children will have big impact on their children, and it will go into generations.
Right.
And we ought to never neglect our children for other pressures that come around. Because I believe, first of all, we're fathers, we're husbands, and we're fathers, and then we're ministers. Where does business come into that? God has blessed me with a business where I have employees, and so I could delegate some, and have done quite a bit of that. And so He's blessed us a lot in those areas. But I do remember those years where I just felt like there was not enough. And that's where I say the grace of God supported us through.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you, Steve, for those words of advice. And again, it comes back down to whatever we prioritize.
We prioritize.
Is going to be king, and
Yes.
it's going to rule. It's going to impact generations
It
from
will.
now.
It
And
will.
so again, if we want to change the world, it starts with me. It
It
starts
does.
with you. It starts in our home. And what we prioritize is what is going to either be a blessing or a curse
That's right.
in the generations to come.
Yeah.
And so to our audience, thank you for tuning in and listening. I believe next week there will not be a podcast, but I think the following week then Pastor John
Okay.
and Pastor Wayne should be back. And so at least that's what it looks like. So thank you, and God bless each one of you,
Yes,
and have
God
a
bless
good
you.
evening. Thank you.
Thank you.